The crisis in Ukraine has focused condemnation on the Kremlin. What's next, and how will China respond?
It looks as if the Ukraine has fought the Russians to a standstill.
The Chinese are watching very carefully the response of the Western countries, the NATO countries, including the United States.
That's next on Seattle University Conversations. Now your hosts, Professor Larry Hubbell and Joni Balter.
Hearty welcome to General Barry McCaffrey and former ambassador to China, Gary Locke. Let's get to the questions. General McCaffrey, anybody with a TV knows how the war in Ukraine began. And the question now is how and when might this end?
Well, I think the best answer is nobody knows. But looking forward, a snapshot the day before the war began, the continuation of the war, because it's actually been direct combat between Russian-backed separatists since 2014. 14,000 killed in action. It was an ongoing, fairly intense ground combat in the east of Ukraine. But now, and when the Russians entered, many people, me included, thought it would likely go very badly for Ukraine from the start. It didn't. If you flash forward to where we are today, I think most of us believe that the Ukrainians, through their incredible organization and courage, calling up 250,000 territorial forces and incorporating them into active combat, and most importantly, the coalition of 41 nations that are feeding qualitative edge technology to the Ukrainians, along with humanitarian and economic assistance, it looks as if the Ukraine has fought the Russians to a standstill. Now, in the next 90 days, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but in the next year or more, it seems likely that Russia will crash to a halt in terms of their manufacturing capability, in terms of their ability to export products, and Ukraine will stay afloat because of Western support. So we hope that's the way it comes out, because there's great lessons to be learned from all this, including the Chinese, who Governor Locke, who I'm very proud to be on this stage with, may want to comment on it, the implications of all this for Taiwan and its future.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because that was my next question. And I wanted to ask you, Ambassador Locke, how important is the United States support for Ukraine vis-a-vis sending a message to China about Taiwan?
Well, I think the Chinese are watching very carefully the response of the Western countries, the NATO countries, including the United States, and the assistance these countries are providing to Ukraine. They're looking at the sanctions, the impact of the sanctions, because if China were to engage in any type of military action against Taiwan, they want to know exactly what the response of the West would be. The economy of Russia and the trade between Russia and the rest of the world is actually fairly small. Obviously, Europe depends a lot on natural resources, oil and natural gas, from Russia. I think everybody was caught off guard or surprised by the swiftness and the severity of the Western sanctions against Russia. I think China will take that into consideration. But it's one thing to cut off Russia, let's say, from the international SWIFT transaction system, the payment system. It may be more difficult to enact some of these similar sanctions against China, because our economies of the United States and China are so integrally intertwined, along with the rest of the world. So, for instance, if China cannot use the international SWIFT payment system, how will our farmers in Iowa get paid for the agriculture they ship to China? How will Boeing get paid, or even Airbus? China exports more to the United States than to all of the EU combined. China is America's largest export destination, at least for our farm goods, outside of Canada and Mexico. And so for many of our industries, for our jobs here in the United States, depend on trade with China. So if we really impose deep sanctions, it's also going to hurt the American people, which is ironic, Europe is still buying natural resources from Russia, and that payments that they make to Russia enables Russia to keep, manufacturing bombs and missiles and things like that they lob into Ukraine. So even Europe, with its sanctions against Russia, has not gone all the way because they're very concerned about cutting off oil and natural gas. In fact, when Russia recently stopped the transport of some of these products, the European countries got angry and got upset. Well, wait a second, how can you be upset when you're also fighting someone and you're supposed to be saying, hey, we want you to stop your behavior, but still be nice to us? Keep sending your oil and natural gas to us. Don't cut us off.
If I could just ask a follow-up then, do you feel like the American response has been strong enough to discourage the Chinese from actually thinking about invading Taiwan?
Well, I think that they have other calculations. I mean, you see, we have seen the destruction of so many cities in Ukraine. If there was a real military conflict with Taiwan, similar destruction would ensue. So China would win if it wins. What do they get? What are they inheriting? What are they going to claim? A completely destroyed economy, mass destruction, and factories that are completely destroyed, the very factories that supply needed products to the mainland. So I think those are all big calculations. And as we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how do you conduct a partial war?
General,
Let me
add I want you both to feel comfortable doing that.
Let me add one note to that, though, on Taiwan, because I'm an outlier on this, clearly, among the military. They had a war game 4 or 5 months ago in Washington, and promptly everybody ran and leaked the results of it to the press an hour later. And the upshot of the war game was a catastrophe for Taiwan and the U.S. forces if China invaded Taiwan. And of course, it was, they had all sorts of metrics, and so we had a pseudo-scientific basis to it. And I've been saying, and I mean it, that if I was an unpaid advisor to President Xi, I'd strongly advise him to not do it. And the difference is 110 miles of open ocean and the United States Navy, and the ability for the Navy to stand offshore and conduct defensive operations well out to sea, 1,000 miles out to sea. So I still think, and we ought to project that image publicly too, I might add, because we're trying to deter warfare, not encourage it. So I was disappointed everyone ran and leaked the results of that outfit. But I don't think China, I hope, will try seizing Taiwan by force. And if it did, at best, the outcome is unpredictable, as it was in Ukraine, which is a far easier problem for the Russians with contiguous borders, and Belarus is a launching pad and that sort of thing, and the Black Sea against a country essentially without a navy. So it's a different, but clearly, as the governor says, the Chinese are watching this intently, and I think in economic and political terms as much as military terms.
Oh, very much so, because China's economy is built on exporting goods to Europe, EU countries, and to the United States. And if there were to be a military conflict, I think the political response from around the world would be very swift and very decisive. It would be a huge disruption to American consumers if we can't buy so much of the stuff that we take for granted on a daily basis that is manufactured from China. But I think the sanctions, the decoupling of our economy would be very severe, but I think the West would go forward with that.
General, what's with all the nuclear threats from Russia? Why are they talking like this now?
Well, that's probably one of the most important questions to ask. I spent much of my life dealing with nuclear weapons, from the tactical level to I was the head arms control negotiator for the JCS with the Russians when the Soviet Union came apart. And so I was in Kyiv negotiating for the Ukrainians to hand their nukes. We were trying to round up all the nukes and get them back into the Russian Federation, which fortunately we were successful in doing, in my view. It was the right thing then and still remains so. But you know, anyone who understands nuclear deterrence, and I practically was up to my neck in it for decades, understands they're not war-fighting weapons, they're political weapons. They're deterrent weapons. You simply can't have an exchange of strategic nuclear weapons and have either the Russian Federation or the U.S. survive as a viable state. It's called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the PSYOP, the nuclear laydown on the Russians. If we gave them an unimpeded first shot at the United States, the response within days would still end Russia. So it doesn't make any sense. So why is Putin saying these things? Well, at one level you can say it's just a threat, it's a bluff. He's trying to make up for conventional warfare weaknesses. Or is it more than that? Is he under such intense pressure? Is his political survival at stake? And, you know, I'm watching a lot of video out of Russian state TV with translation subtitles, and it is horrifying what we're hearing. Apparently educated, responsible, older people say that the seconds to time on target for the Russian Satan nuclear missile to Berlin, Paris, and London, a 40-year-old, highly educated young woman saying, well, if we have a strategic nuclear exchange, at least we'll go to heaven and they won't. Oh my gosh, it's just bizarre. You know, if that was somebody in the street spouting off, you could say, well, they don't understand what they're saying. But Putin and his senior leadership understands what's going on. Then we go to the second level, tactical nuclear weapons. And you know, when we want to understand what a foreign adversary will do, what we do is we see what did they write down as their doctrine, and then are they training as they wrote their doctrine. And the Russians in the last, about 7 years ago, wrote into their doctrine that they said if the existential life of Russia's at stake, we will escalate to de-escalate. We'll fire a tactical nuke, and then we'll shock them, and we'll say, now we want to talk. But once you start that, you know, a tactical nuclear weapon would essentially include weapons up to the level of the ones we used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what would your target be? Kharkiv and kill 200,000 Ukrainians? Poland to knock out a U.S. delivery air base? An air burst over the Black Sea? It's just complete mumbo jumbo, but they're saying it. So I think we have to, Biden and Lloyd Austin and Blinken have been very, I think, conservative and thoughtful about how they talk in public. We did not alert our nuclear forces when Putin said he was, and we're not going to get into the kind of exchange in public on what would the outcome be, but it's nutty behavior.
Ambassador Locke, I heard John Huntsman, former ambassador to both China and Russia, say this is the end of the Putin era because he has to fight on two sides. Ukraine, where people truly hate him, many of them, and Russia, where people will become increasingly enraged as the body bags come home. What do you think of that? Is this the end of the Putin era?
Well, it really depends on, and perhaps the general is in a better position to comment on that, but it depends on how long this drags out and what the casualties are for the Russian forces and whether or not the public ever learns of that casualty. That's the hard part. I mean, it's one thing to say certain families know that their loved ones have died, but will they somehow add them all up and understand? I think that what will hurt Putin is the effect on the economy and the disruption to everyday life. And if that really drags out, because this is a mired, almost stalemate military situation, it's going to constantly drain the economy of Russia as they put more money into replacing the weapons and so forth. And if everyday people are struggling, if their factories are shut down, they can't get paid for doing this or that and selling things to the West, or shipments to the West are stopped, then that domestic pressure is always, I think, the thing that politicians and leaders always worry about. It's certainly the concern of the leaders of China, any type of domestic unrest. Or even here in the United States, it's always that domestic issue. Governors and mayors are always concerned about unemployment, safety on the streets, et cetera, et cetera. Domestic tranquility is number one for all these national leaders.
General McCaffrey, when I was in Russia in the mid-90s, I interviewed ex-communists who worked in government and other people, and I talked to a lot of people who were both resentful of the United States and the loss of the Russian Empire. That seemed to be a dominant theme. Do you believe that Putin has been really successful in tapping these resentments?
By the way, I spent a lot of time in Russia as an arms control guy, and when the Soviet Union first came apart, it was very interesting to me. I'd spent most of my adult life trying to understand the Russian military, and suddenly I was in a room full with them, and we spent most of our time negotiating in Moscow, almost occasionally in Vienna or places, but almost never back in the U.S. And they were frightened of me. When we have a break, I'd get up in uniform. Most of our delegation obviously was State Department, which has the lead on all these things, and I'd walk around the table and put my arm around some big hefty lad, and they'd all break out in a cold sweat. It was like having a naked orangutan suddenly embrace you. And then I started, I was a 3-star general, assistant to Powell, and I started inviting Russian generals over as my guest. And it honked off Powell no end. I'd say, sir, come on, I got to work these guys. And so we had very friendly relations with them. It was astonishing. I spent Christmas one year in Vienna with a Russian delegation. They didn't have the money to go home. And so the U.S. delegation stayed with them. We had Christmas with them. And it was a very interesting situation. Now, I went back again, I can't remember if it was Council on Foreign Relations or Atlantic Council, and did talking about deterrence, terrorism, that kind of thing, starting in NATO and ending up in Moscow. And this is a little bit harsh language, but I got to tell you. So here's 30 Russian defense intellectuals in a room, half of them in uniform. They're all semi-drunk. They're all nationalist, ugly, talking people of the worst sort. But even then, I'd go in and interview GRU officers and senior general staff officers, and I had to tell people I could have bought their uniform off them for $100 in their office, left them there in their underwear and walked out. So they were had come apart. And I tell people that's not good for U.S. national security. We did not want to see the Russian Federation shamed. We didn't want them to be incompetent. We spent $2 billion a year on non-Lugar money trying to help them round up their nuclear weapons. They were unguarded. They'd leave SS-25 batteries out in the forest with nuke warheads and go into the village. And so we said a weak Russia is not in the advantage of the United States. So I think Putin did come into office, and following that poor drunken Yeltsin and magnificent Gorbachev, who put the world on a better trajectory. And Putin came in and capitalized on that. And he still, apparently, no one's sure, has very high levels of domestic support in this war. But along with Governor Locke, this is going to fade in the coming year. Things are not pleasant in Moscow right now. They like McDonald's burgers. They like being able to travel to France in the summer. So, keep our fingers crossed. We do not want to end up with Russia angry, shamed, and collapsed at the end of the day. It's not to our advantage.
Ambassador Locke, going back to the 70s, part of Nixon and Kissinger's geopolitical strategy was to try to create divisions between China and the Soviet Union. Today, should the Biden administration pursue a policy that seeks to upset this growing relationship between Russia and China?
Well, the whole point of Nixon's trip to China and Kissinger's trip to China was, in fact, to try to break the alliance between Russia and China. And that has succeeded to a great extent. But at the same time, Russia and China are still very close allies. They're more separated. Their economies are very vastly different. China's economy is so much more mature, and their technological advancements really outpace everything of Russia. But they are still, in some ways, aligned in their animosity toward the United States and what they perceive as the dominance of the United States and the West, and the arrogance, what they perceive to be the arrogance of the West. And so they really bristle at the fact that the United States has set the rules on so many international organizations and mechanisms, whether it's the World Bank to the Asia Development Bank, and so that's why China has started creating its own alternative systems. China and many of the other developing countries around the world feel the same way, whether it's India, Brazil, Russia, saying, hey, we're now really maturing. We outnumber all of you. We're part of the club, but we make up the majority of the club, but you guys have set all the rules. And we're having to live by these rules that we had no say in putting together. You should at least be open to some, alternative viewpoints and modifications and reforms, but the United States basically says no. And so they're really upset at what they feel to be the dominance, the arrogance of the West. And so that's why China is still aligned with Russia, only in terms of common animosity toward the West. And I think that what's interesting is that while China is repeating all of the official slogans, justifications for and supporting Russia's military actions against Ukraine, saying this is all because of the United States, all because of NATO, it's self-defense. NATO has really threatened the security of Russia, and so what Russia is doing is natural, and we support them. But they're also saying, well, we hope that there will be peace, and we hope there will be a negotiated peace. But of course, they're just saying that to make it sound good. They're not in any position to help do anything about it or to bring negotiations. But what's interesting is that they're showing the Chinese people are able to see all the pictures on CNN and BBC of the destruction and the savagery that's occurring within Ukraine. So the government, on the one hand, is espousing the Russian line, but they're seeing this incredible destruction and inhumanity occurring within Ukraine. What's also interesting is that China is not providing any military assistance to Russia, nor are they trying to buy any of the goods and services or natural resources that Russia would have been sending to the rest of the world.
But on that point, that China is not providing that assistance, isn't that in some ways a victory for Ukraine or even the U.S.?
Well, it's because they've seen the severity and the impact of the sanctions, and they're very concerned about being sanctioned were they to assist Russia. Because again, the U.S.-China economy, the integration of our economies, the dependence on each other, is much more consequential than any trade between Russia and China.
You sort of get the impression that they're a more thoughtful leadership group also, that they think through what's happening, it's less impulsive.
Well, they certainly understand what's more important, which is, yes, they would love to get oil and natural gas from Russia, but at what cost? To have suddenly the United States not sell stuff or buy stuff from China? That would really, when we talk about domestic tranquility, having hundreds of millions of people suddenly out of work would cause absolutely mayhem and could threaten the survival and the security and the legitimacy of the Communist Party.
General McCaffrey, would allowing Ukraine into NATO provide more or less security for that country?
Well, it's like, do we want to redo the draft? It's never going to happen, ever. And and shouldn't have. And I think it was a fundamental mistake by, I love the Bush 41, the older Bush, but it was a fundamental mistake of U.S. foreign policy to open the door for Ukraine to eventually become a member of NATO without actually giving them the protection. So it was, I think, a terrible mistake. And it resulted in some ways in immediate Russian aggression against Georgia and then eventually the follow on the Donbass. But I think what will happen, assuming a victory, however we define that, by Ukraine, which I support and believe is going to eventually happen, Ukraine ought to be part of the European Union. Their values are trending toward the West. They're going to be an active democracy. They're in the right geographic position to take part in European Union activities. And there's obviously a security implication of that. But again, the end of the war, how will it end? And it won't end unless there's, from Zelensky's viewpoint, unless there's some Western guarantee of the peace. I think at the end of the day, he's quite likely to give up, to say we'll have a referendum in 30 years about Crimea and the Donbass and maybe other pieces to it. But the Ukrainians will never stop fighting unless there's a genuine peace enforced by some outfit, probably not NATO, some coalition of the willing, the Pope, you name it. But
if he's available, sure.
Yeah, if he's available, right. So I hope there is a peace a year or so from now and that we get guarantees on it. But it'd be too provocative to have to entertain. I mean, look what's going on in Finland. It's quite amusing to me. I mean, the Russians have got 60% of their ground combat forces mired in Ukraine right now. And we're saying, I'm not sure I believe this, that they've suffered 25% losses in personnel and equipment. I think that's high, but it's been significant losses. And so the notion that the Russians have committed half their air force to Ukraine, it's outrageous. So, and I tell people Russia is actually a second or third tier country, depending on how you want to count it. On manufacturing, the only thing they've got is a lot of nuclear weapons and a lot of oil and gas. And almost nothing else has salience in the Western European economy. So they're going to threaten Finland and Sweden. Sweden disarmed almost completely. The Finns have a 1 million-man army when mobilized, and they will fight. So, I mean, the threats to Finland are nonsensical, but Putin is, and he was running, apparently, nuclear-carrying aircraft near the border of Finland a couple weeks ago as a demonstration threat. So I think Ukraine's not going to be part of NATO, shouldn't be, but they will end up as part of the European Union.
Ambassador Locke, recently Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has suggested that the United States has an additional goal in Ukraine, and that is weakening Russia's military capability. Should that be a public goal of America's foreign policy?
Well, I think that we need to be very clear that we support Ukraine and that our goal is to help Ukraine defend itself and to resist the Russian forces. I think when you start saying we have other objectives, then I think it dilutes our message and takes our focus off. And our standing in the world, I think, is a little bit questioned. Are we in it to really hurt Russia, or are we in it to really protect Ukraine and to stand up for Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and its integrity? So, I think that will be the impact of a long, drawn-out conflict, but I don't think we want a long, drawn-out conflict.
But the fact that he made it a public goal, I mean, he said it publicly. General McCaffrey, do you have any thoughts about that?
He said it a couple times, I saw.
Well, and Mr. Biden, who I've known for 25 years, also said Putin is a terrorist and he can't be allowed to remain in power, and we're thinking of putting him on the list of state sponsors of terror. And so Richard Haas, who's one of the most stable, informed people dealing with these issues, he thinks it's a huge mistake by both Biden and Lloyd Austin. I'm less concerned about it, to be honest. What I do think is it's unhelpful for the President of the United States to blurt out things at press conferences. He needs to stay out of that. and only say something that's been written down after the interagency process vets it.
It's hard for President Biden.
Yeah, he can't do it. He can't do it. He's the most garrulous man that ever lived in the land. I admire him enormously. He's a decent, lovely man with a lot of experience. But I once spent 2 days driving around his state. He was giving me a tutorial on drug abuse, which he knew a lot about. And I told him at the end of the 2 days, I considered jumping to my desk from the car to get away from his voice. So we need to be measured. The President of the United States shouldn't ever use inflammatory language. Now, Lloyd Austin, he walked out of the National Security Council meeting, and that's obviously what we're saying. Because we don't want a lot of language about giving Putin an off-ramp, giving Putin a victory. We don't want that. We want him to be absolutely convinced he lost at every level. And then over time reduce sanctions and political isolation and diplomatic, but we definitely want him to say, boy, that one didn't work at all. I guess we'd better not try the Baltic states. We'd better not try Poland or Finland. So I'm less concerned about Austin, but the President of the United States ought to be cautious in his language. You're right.
I have a question for both of you, starting with you, General. How much do you think Putin miscalculated, that his many objectives have backfired?
Well, he locked up his FSB, Director of Foreign Intelligence, in, Leverenko prison, right where the old thugs from the NKVD used to torture people to death. He locked up a bunch of his senior people in Moscow, very interesting to me. And we think he sidelined the Secretary of Defense, who was, but a lot of, people who stay in power as long as Mr. Putin has, and even in 8 years as U.S. president, I've watched this in Washington. If you tell the boss things they don't want to hear, you end up not in their office. And I've heard people say, oh, we can't have Colonel so-and-so go in and brief the chairman. He honked him off 2 years ago. Don't use him as a briefer. So that happened. So Putin's in a bubble now. He didn't miss the Finland, Sweden economic sanctions. He's now getting the notion that his military has been fought to a standstill. But he's been in a real bubble of information. I don't know where this is going to go. It's pretty hard getting him out of office. He's got 2,500 security people around him. He is really protected.
And the table, for gosh sakes, the table. You can't even get close.
He's got a separate compound 20 miles outside of Moscow. He's sort of personally safe. And I listened to one of the Russian dissidents, a brilliant man, courageous man, fortunately he's out of Russia, say his generals are more likely to go in and shoot him than tell him the truth. So everything he's hearing is being filtered. But now the filters are running out. I mean, they are in a strategic disaster from every quarter you can look, economic, diplomatic, covert intelligence, nothing's working for him. Information warfare, to my astonishment, isn't working well for him.
We probably thought it was better than it is. Ambassador Locke, that question.
No, I think clearly he has miscalculated the response of NATO and the Western countries, the United States, in terms of sanctions. Clearly underestimated the resistance, the fortitude, the dedication of the Ukrainian people and the military. Certainly miscalculated the depth of the sanctions and the extensiveness of the sanctions. So, yeah, I think he's and I think he expected the military operation to be over fairly quickly, but it's really dragged out with great casualties, unfortunately, on both sides.
Ambassador Locke, do you believe that there are already natural interests that between Russia and China that they share, aside from a penchant for authoritarianism and a desire to block the influence of the U.S.?
No, while they may have a common genesis in terms of their political systems of communism, I think they've diverged so much, and the the politics of China is a socialism with a capitalistic flavor or characteristics, and so the economies, the dynamics of the people are so radically different. But they do have that common enmity against the United States. I mean, there was a time in which anything the United States said, China immediately grabbed onto and followed. The United States was the standard of its economy, of its social systems, of design and engineering, et cetera, et cetera. But then as China began to mature, learning so much from the West, they began to see the mistakes of the West. Our response to Hurricane Katrina, the collapse of the financial markets during the financial meltdown in 2007, 2008, the prime mortgage collapse, et cetera, et cetera. And so China is now beginning to say, well, maybe the American model isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Maybe we can do things better on our own, which is why they are so, and plus they're trying to overcome this feeling of inferiority that they feel was imposed upon them by the West, from the Opium Wars to the fact that the invasion by Japan, and of course some of the and even some of the inwardness of some of their most recent emperors, and so they really, because China used to be viewed themselves as the center of the universe, the most exalted civilization. And their image has been tarnished, which is why they're so hell-bent on reestablishing and restoring their stature. The Beijing Olympics was a way to show the world how much they had matured. Landing a spacecraft on the moon, all right? And all their technological prowess, and the list goes on and on. So they're really trying to reestablish their stature and regain the respect that China has had for thousands and thousands of years.
Thank you. General McCaffrey, in the 90s, the United States maintained a fairly good relationship with the Yeltsin administration. And I wonder if at that time, the U.S. foreign policy establishment ever seriously considered making Russia a member of NATO. And if they didn't, was that a lost opportunity?
Well, the easy part is it wasn't a lost opportunity. It would have been, as much as we hate to admit it, the whole basis of NATO was fear of the USSR, of possible aggression. It went on for 2+ generations, and it was a valid concern. And it's been just, by the way, underscored by the invasion of Ukraine. This will be 100 years before Western Europe's going to forget this one. I had a lot of dealings directly with the Yeltsin administration, and we were very supportive. We did a lot of significant arms control reductions with them. We did add them to, they had a sizable contingent, a 2-star general and 200 some odd officers in Brussels at the political headquarters. And they were part of a partnership for peace, which was a greatly expanded sort of second tier to NATO. But it wouldn't have made any sense whatsoever. And by the way, Yeltsin himself, personally, the poor man was a total alcoholic, fall down, drunken embarrassment to the Russians, which I think set the stage for Putin as a fairly junior guy to end up with his self-discipline and his cleverness and his ruthless pursuit of power to come into office. But no, I don't think we ever, would have considered. Russia is the problem. I mean, that's the bottom line. They got nukes and determination. This is their 4th invasion, and they got away with the other ones in Putin's mindset. He's saying when he went into Ukraine, the war will be over. And it took them, in Chechnya, it took them 2 years to subdue the Chechens, and they devastated the society when they did so, and they took hundreds of thousands of casualties. So he went in saying, I'm prepared to fight for 2 years in Ukraine. These people will get over it.
That's a good segue to the question I wanted to ask you, General, and we're going to go after this question to our student and our professor, but U.S. intelligence experts now say they believe Putin is preparing for just what you're talking about, a prolonged conflict in Ukraine, and that he still intends to achieve goals beyond the Donbass. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think in his mind, this was beyond a power play. He thinks Mother Russia needs to reintegrate Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Georgia back into the Russian Federation. And he'd love to recreate the USSR with the Baltic states and Poland and that sort of thing. But he really sees, I think, in his heart, the disaster of the dissolution, the Gorbachev dissolution of the government of the USSR was the greatest catastrophe in history, and he's bound and determined to get it back. I think now, as a professional viewpoint, he can't do it. He could possibly retain.
But nobody's telling him.
But I think give him a year, and these people, every month, they'll be in worse trouble. Of course, the tragedy is Ukraine's being devastated, and tens of thousands of civilians killed, and the infrastructure knocked into the ground. But I think in the longer run, he's going to go down the tubes. He can't maintain this. Just on manpower alone. Now he toyed with conscription. He toyed with declaration of war. The Russians have some fake laws that prevent them, allegedly, from conscripting people and putting them into foreign wars. So he backed off that. But they actually are, I should tell people their active ground combat force was about a third larger than the U.S. Marine Corps. So when it comes to total military power, NATO completely outclasses the Russian Federation. So I don't think he's got great options. He's run out of ideas, and now we'll have to see how his senior people around him deal with this.
Okie dokes. Stay with us. We're going to take a quick break and bring up our student and our professor. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're very pleased to have two additional questioners, and one of them is Dr. Olga Krupa, who's an associate professor in the Institute of Public Service, and the other is Maura Rock, who is an undergraduate student who's majoring in history and political science. So we'll just hand it over to you two.
All right, good evening, everyone. My question is for both the General and the Ambassador, and it pertains to Russia as the last standing colonial empire. So, in the last 2 months, Russia committed every possible war crime in Ukraine. And it's not just Putin, it's the majority of Russian population who have these imperial ambitions and the desire to grow. And it's threatening not just the invasion of Ukraine, but the rest of Europe. And to end this chaos and violence they have produced, Eastern Europeans believe that Russia as a federal state has to end. And even though in the West you like seeing Russia as one, we can't wait to see its republics cede from the center. So we would like to see the Chechen Republic, Buryatia, Dagestan, Yakutia, all these regions to cede from the center and gain their identity as a national state. Now, question to you. Will the United States be prepared to recognize their independence?
Well, I don't know exactly how that independence could occur. And would they simply declare their independence? What would Russia do in terms of stopping that? I don't know that the West is prepared to really interfere with the internal politics of what is now Russia. Our ability right now to even help the Ukrainians is very, very limited. And so I'm not sure that there's an appetite for all of the Western countries or the EU to address any efforts by some of the states to cede from the Russian Federation or from Russia.
Yeah, I think you as a professor studying in Russia would have a view on this, but it always reminds me, one of my friends was a covert intelligence agent, a genuine American, learned Russian, said he was pretty fluent, but I said, well, how can you possibly get away with wandering around Russia? And clearly you must have an American accent. And he said, look, he said, half the country doesn't grow up speaking Russian. And so they didn't ever question that I'm, who I say I am. I think there is zero chance of the Russian Federation breaking up, and certainly we would stay 100 miles away from even thinking that that was a good idea. And if in the states that have tried to break away, like Chechnya, ended up being devastated by the Russian armed forces and the GRU. So I don't think that would ever happen, and it might well result in another generation of civil war inside the Russian Federation. So I think my personal view is we want Russia as a member of the family of nations, be economically sound, to stop threatening their neighbors. I don't know how we get there, given Putin and Ukraine and Georgia and Aleppo and and the Donbass and Crimea. I don't know how we get there, but our end goal ought to be a sound Russia, not one endlessly civil war. One of the enclaves, you know everything about the internal politics, I'm sure, of the Russian Federation. One of the enclaves of Muslim Republic, like 150 miles from Moscow. So trying to keep the Russian Federation together has been really a challenge to them. Look, they're back in Kazakhstan now with Russian paratroopers, so they're not going to go quietly into the night on this one.
This question is for General McCaffrey. Historically, propaganda has been a useful tool when turning the tide of war. How have you seen propaganda used in this particular conflict, and what impact do you think that it has had?
Well, here's another one of the great surprises of this conflict. If you talked about information warfare, the Russians are at a D- and the Ukrainians are at an A+. It's been simply astonishing. And the Ukrainians mostly aren't using propaganda, mostly aren't ever putting out things that are factually incorrect. But from Zelensky on down, these people have come across as transparent, as courageous, as democratic, values-based, and the Russians have been a disaster. You watch Russian state TV and listen to grown people talking about nuclear warfare. So that's another area in which the purported strength of the Russians has ended up. And by the way, I felt this way about interfering in our election. We had a great foo-fa that they may have tipped the election to. They were trying to tip the election toward Trump, but I didn't think that didn't have a fundamental impact on anything going on in the United States. Reality will normally intrude on propaganda at some point, and that's what's happened in Ukraine, I think.
There clearly is propaganda being orchestrated by the Russian government, and it's also being repeated by the Chinese government. And so the people within China are hearing the official line, the justification for the invasion, but it doesn't square with, and if it's an invasion based on self-defense, the pictures that the people are seeing, certainly in the West and certainly within China, do not square with that official rhetoric or propaganda.
As a follow-up to that question, to what extent do you think Putin himself has been involved in the perpetration of this propaganda, or do you think that it is done by a completely separate ministry?
Well, obviously it's all orchestrated and it's part of the Russian government. It's all one government. It has to be coordinated. And so, everything that he's been saying himself is part of that official line. And so that's all carefully orchestrated.
One thing it's not propaganda. One thing that surprised me on a strategic level, Putin, in terms of being a war criminal, clearly violated the international laws of war by directly attacking civilian targets and their infrastructure. Just no question. It was visible. It's on nightly TV, and he's killed tens of thousands of Ukrainians doing so. So that's a visible giant war crime. But go down to the 95 combat battalions of the Russian army that went into Ukraine, you know, every military in war has trouble controlling their own soldiers. There's 3 to 5% of American units, I tell people, they don't have a sign on their head, but you got to watch what they're doing in combat. They're armed, they're away from their mothers, they're in foreign countries. So you always have to worry about the discipline of your combat units. But in the Russian case, across the board, almost without exception, they've been routinely committing the most heinous of crimes. Just unbelievable. So it's not, I don't think it's a failure of the battalion commanders, it's a failure of the culture, of the history. It's shocking, because I don't think you'd see that in most modern armies.
I have a question relating to our students who are studying international relations and international affairs at Seattle U. So you probably could observe that all post-World War II international security architecture has been broken. On February 24th, the role of United Nations and all their committees has been nullified. Russia is presiding at the UN Security Council. It can neither be dismissed or dismembered from it, and it's dropping phosphorus bombs on Ukrainian cities at the same time. Is there hope for our students who are interested in international affairs and want to work for one of these global units that were created after the war to promote peace and security?
Well, you know, I've spent a lot of time in and out of the UN as a U.S. government official and as an academic, and I think it has enormous value to the global community and the United States. And it's primarily a forum for debate, for discussion, to form connections, and so we should preserve and treasure what the UN can do. But there are a lot of things it can't do. And one of them, the nature, there's zero possibility of ever changing the Security Council. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So Russia, China, the U.S. are going to have permanent vetoes. Why the French are there instead of the Indians. So there's always a debate in the sidelines, but there's no chance that the UN can take action when powerful nations don't go along with it. What is important, it seems to me, is to look at other international institutions, NATO, the European Union, our alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, who have come aboard in the most astonishing manner. I mean, I've served in the political headquarters of NATO for 3 years, and I used to tell people that it took an average of 5 years for us to make a simple decision in NATO. It was just unbelievable. Now the coalition at 30, I was served there when I was 16, came to the rescue of Ukraine in the most dramatic fashion. Not across the board. We got problems in Hungary. The Germans still have a different stance on some of these issues. But so we ought to preserve our institutions and nurture them where we can, and that includes the United Nations.
I think certainly what's happened with Ukraine and the United Nations shows the limitations of many of these global institutions. They were established under different premises, different times, for instance, the UN in the aftermath of World War II, in which Russia and China were seen as key allies in terms of the pursuit of peace and would be serving as the foundation for this global institution. But we're seeing over time that various institutions have limited authority but are still useful in different ways. We should not look to these international institutions as being the be-all and the solve-all for all situations. We have problems with, for instance, the WTO. We have problems with the World Bank. So to think that that one institution can somehow address all of these issues, I think, is a false premise, and we need to start thinking about which institutions are better equipped to address some of these issues.
So we just have 4 minutes left. Go ahead.
Well, my last question then is for Ambassador Locke. With your experience as Washington's governor and considering your earlier remarks about how Putin seems to be in this conflict for the long haul, how do you see this affecting Washington's military-industrial complex, and how can we also see it affecting Washington's economy?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, Boeing is a major defense contractor, but much of the Boeing defense work is not in the state of Washington. I think we do, of course, Russia is a major producer of titanium, which Airbus and Boeing need. In fact, the U.S. military needs some of that titanium. So if anything, I think what this conflict with Russia and of course, COVID and possible and the current trade frictions with China and the global supply chain, China's response to locking down whole cities, if there's even 1 or 2 cases of COVID, really demonstrates the need for more countries, all countries around the world, to have more independent, diversified supplies of key equipment, whether it's medical equipment, whether it's food, whether it's machinery and high tech. So I think you're going to see, first of all, Washington State does not do that much trade with Russia. Clearly with the Asia-Pacific countries, namely China. But that is going to change, and I think, but I think our economy will be relatively unaffected by what's happening in Ukraine. I actually have a question for General McCaffrey, if you don't mind. So if this is going to be a long-haul conflict, and the Russian forces are being mired in with the resistance of the Ukrainian military and the people, what would Putin do? Would he just continue to lob missiles from the security and the sanctity of the Russian territory and just keep trying to destroy the eastern parts of Ukraine in order to force some sort of political settlement? I mean, how can he viably, effectively continue this reign of terror and destruction over the long haul?
And less than 1 minute to answer.
I think the answer is I don't know, and I don't think the Russians know, and the Ukrainians don't know. But my whole sense of this is every day that goes by, Russia's in a worse situation in terms of casualties and morale of their forces, their manufacturing ability, even being a pariah nation. You know, that gets to the educated classes in the Russian big cities. So I think at some point he's going to hit bottom. And then the question, you're right, is to what extent does Putin able to dominate and keep Russian defense and foreign policy and economic policy under his firm control? I think that's limited. So, you know, at the end of the day, we're going to have to be very careful how we deal with this guy. They do have nuclear weapons, and they do have natural gas and oil, and both of them we need to take into account and be very forward-thinking in how we deal with this guy.
We're going to have to wrap right there. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll be back with programs similar to this in the fall, and good night.